What if I told you, heaven is not waiting for permission to move, but you are the one who has been authorized to enforce it? And the reason many believers are still struggling is because they're negotiating with what they were supposed to command. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why every time you negotiate with the enemy, you're actually surrendering authority you never lost. If this is opening your eyes, take a moment right now, pause and reflect. Where have you been negotiating instead of commanding? And if you're receiving this truth, subscribe, follow, because the next message will show you how to activate authority in your daily life with precision and boldness. The first key truth is that the believer is not a beggar in prayer, but a representative of heaven's authority on earth. This completely changes the way a person sees their identity, especially in prayer and spiritual life. Many people approach prayer as if they are trying to convince a distant power to act, but the foundation of this truth is that the believer has already been given a legal and spiritual position to act on behalf of a higher kingdom. In that sense, prayer is not about emotional persuasion. It is about exercising delegated authority. A representative does not speak from personal weakness or uncertainty. They speak with the authority of the one who sent them. So when a believer prays, they are not trying to wake up God or move him into action as though he is reluctant. Rather, they are aligning themselves with what has already been established and enforcing it in the earthly realm. This means the believer's words carry weight when they are spoken in faith and in alignment with divine will. Understanding this removes passivity from prayer. Instead of long, desperate begging, the believer begins to pray with confidence, clarity, and direction. Authority always assumes position, and position determines how you speak. A person who knows they are authorized does not sound unsure. They issue spiritual rulings based on truth already revealed. This is why faith-filled declarations are so important. They are not wishes thrown into the air, but authoritative statements rooted in identity. When a believer realizes they represent a higher kingdom, their mindset shifts from, "I hope this happens," to "this must align with what has already been declared." That internal shift is what transforms prayer from struggle into command. This also means that spiritual effectiveness is not based on emotional intensity, but on understanding of identity. A believer who knows their position can speak even in weakness and still carry authority, because the power is not in the feelings, but in the delegated right behind the words. So the believer stops negotiating with circumstances and starts representing a finished work, enforcing what has already been provided and established in their spiritual jurisdiction. The second truth is that authority is not something you ask for, it is something you receive and enforce. This is one of the most misunderstood principles in the life of a believer, because many assume that authority is granted repeatedly based on effort, emotion, or spiritual performance. But in reality, authority is not earned through struggle. It is received through position and relationship. Once it is received, it does not increase or decrease based on feelings. It remains constant, waiting to be used. In natural terms, authority works like delegated power. When someone is appointed to represent a higher office, they do not go back every day asking if they still have permission to act. Their authority is already established in the appointment itself. The same principle applies spiritually. The believer does not approach life trying to obtain authority over and over again. They step into situations already carrying it. The issue is not whether authority exists, it is whether it is being recognized and exercised. This shifts everything about how challenges are handled. Instead of praying as though something must still be granted, the believer begins to enforce what has already been given. That means speaking with certainty rather than hesitation, and responding to opposition with confidence rather than uncertainty. Authority is activated through use, not through request. If it is never exercised, it remains dormant, but it is still fully present. This also exposes why many believers feel powerless, even though they are not. The problem is not absence of authority, but lack of enforcement. A person can have legal rights and still live as though they do not, if they never act on those rights. Spiritually, this happens when believers keep asking for what they are meant to command. Instead of declaring healing, they repeatedly ask for it. Instead of resisting fear, they negotiate with it. Instead of standing firm, they retreat into pleading. But true understanding brings a shift. Authority is not a prayer topic, it is a life position. Once a believer knows they have received it, their responsibility changes from asking to acting. They stop trying to convince heaven to move and start enforcing heaven's reality on earth through faith-filled words and unwavering stance. The third truth is that spiritual victory is not achieved through negotiation, but through declaration. This means that the believer is not called to debate outcomes in the spirit realm, but to announce them in alignment with truth. Negotiation implies uncertainty, delay, and compromise, as if two opposing sides are trying to reach a middle ground. But in spiritual authority, there is no middle ground between truth and deception. There is only enforcement of what has already been established. When a believer enters situations with a negotiating mindset, their words become weakened by hesitation. They begin to sound like they are requesting permission from problems rather than confronting them with authority. This is why many prayers remain powerless in expression, even when they are sincere in intention. Sincerity alone does not shift circumstances. Alignment with authority does. Declaration, on the other hand, carries certainty. It does not ask if something can happen. It states what must align. In this context, faith is not a discussion with conditions. It is a proclamation of what is already settled in the higher reality. The believer speaks not to convince the situation, but to command it to respond. This is why words become central. Speech is not casual in spiritual authority. It is legislative. What is spoken in alignment with truth becomes the standard that circumstances are expected to follow. Negotiation keeps a person in a cycle of waiting, but declaration moves a person into enforcement. Waiting suggests something still needs approval, while declaration assumes approval has already been granted in the higher realm. That shift is what turns prayer from passive expression into active authority. The believer stops saying, "If it is your will," in moments where the will has already been revealed, and begins to speak with clarity rooted in that revelation. This also means opposition is not a signal to reconsider, but a signal to reinforce. When resistance appears, it is not the time to adjust the message, but to repeat it with greater confidence. The authority of the believer is revealed in consistency, not compromise. What is declared in faith is meant to stand firm until what is unseen becomes visible, not through negotiation, but through unwavering spoken authority. The fourth truth is that the enemy operates through deception, not power, and he only wins when authority is ignored. This means the core strategy of spiritual opposition is not direct strength, but manipulation of perception. The enemy does not need to overpower a believer who understands their position. He only needs to convince that believer to doubt it. Once doubt enters, authority is no longer exercised, even though it is still fully present. Deception works by creating false agreements in the mind. It suggests that circumstances are more final than truth, that symptoms are stronger than authority, or that delay means denial. When a believer accepts these suggestions, even unknowingly, they begin to act below their position. This is where spiritual loss actually happens, not because authority was removed, but because it was not used. Authority that is unused becomes ineffective in experience, even though it remains legally intact. The enemy's influence is therefore conditional. He does not have independent power to override a believer who is standing in truth. Instead, he relies on silence, hesitation, and agreement with fear. The moment a believer starts to argue with deception instead of resisting it, they shift from authority to reasoning, and reasoning is not the language of command. It is the language of uncertainty. This is why awareness is so critical. A believer who recognizes deception does not engage it as an equal force. They reject it immediately because authority is not designed for debate. It is designed for enforcement. When deception speaks, authority responds, not with discussion, but with correction. The believer does not try to analyze fear endlessly. They replace it with truth spoken clearly and firmly. Understanding this also removes intimidation from opposition. Challenges are no longer interpreted as signs of defeat, but as attempts to disrupt clarity. And once clarity remains intact, authority remains active. The enemy cannot override a believer who refuses agreement with deception. His only pathway is through consent, and when consent is withdrawn, his influence collapses. So victory is not about wrestling with a stronger force. It is about refusing to accept a false report. The believer stands firm in truth, and in that firmness, deception loses its ability to shape reality. The fifth truth is that words of faith are not wishes. They are rulings backed by divine jurisdiction. This completely redefines the purpose and weight of what a believer speaks. In the natural mind, words are often treated as expressions of desire, something we say to hope for change. But in spiritual authority, words are not expressions of desire. They are expressions of position. They are not aimed upward as requests alone, but released outward as commands aligned with a higher authority already established. A wish is uncertain. It hopes something might happen. A ruling is definite. It declares what must align. When a believer speaks in faith, they are not trying to convince heaven to agree. They are enforcing what heaven has already declared as truth. This is why alignment is more important than intensity. Loudness does not make a wish powerful, but clarity makes a declaration effective. Authority flows through agreement with what is already settled, not emotional effort to change what is uncertain. This means the believer's voice becomes a tool of enforcement, not persuasion. Just as a judge in a courtroom does not negotiate outcomes but issues verdicts based on law, the believer speaks based on spiritual jurisdiction already granted. The power is not in personality or volume, but in legitimacy. When words are rooted in truth, they carry authority that circumstances are expected to respond to. This also corrects a common spiritual error, treating prayer as repeated begging until something changes. But rulings are not repeated because of doubt. They are declared because of certainty. The believer does not keep asking for what has already been established. Instead, they reinforce it until manifestation aligns with the spoken reality. Repetition in faith is not desperation. It is reinforcement of an already issued decree. Understanding this shifts the believer from emotional speech to authoritative speech. Instead of speaking from pressure, they speak from position. Instead of reacting to what is seen, they declare what is already true in the unseen. And in that place, words stop being wishes floating in uncertainty and become firm rulings that shape direction, challenge deception, and establish alignment with spiritual truth. The sixth truth is that believers must learn to stand their ground instead of pleading for what already belongs to them. This principle shifts the entire posture of faith from pursuit to possession. Many people approach spiritual life as if they are trying to convince God to release something that is still withheld, but the foundation of authority reveals a different reality. What has been given does not need to be re-earned, it needs to be enforced and held. Standing your ground means refusing to move mentally or spiritually from what has already been established in truth. It is the decision to remain fixed even when circumstances push back. The pressure of contradiction is real, but it does not define authority. It only tests whether authority will be used. Pleading in this context often reveals uncertainty about possession. A person pleads for what they are not sure they have, but a person who knows they have it begins to stand firm, not asking for confirmation, but resisting opposition. This is where many believers unintentionally weaken their own position. Instead of maintaining a stance, they shift between faith and doubt, between declaration and request, between confidence and fear. That internal instability produces external delay in experience, not because the promise is absent, but because the stance is inconsistent. Standing your ground is therefore not emotional, it is resolute. In spiritual terms, ground represents revealed truth already received. Once that truth is known, the responsibility is no longer to request it repeatedly, but to guard it. The believer becomes like a steward protecting what has been entrusted to them. When opposition arises, it is not treated as a signal to retreat, but as a signal to hold position more firmly. This also removes unnecessary struggle from prayer. Instead of long cycles of begging and uncertainty, prayer becomes a place of reaffirmation. The believer reminds themselves of what is already theirs and refuses to be shifted by what contradicts it. Standing your ground is the quiet strength of unwavering conviction, where silence can be as powerful as speech because the internal position does not change. Ultimately, this truth establishes that possession in the spirit realm is maintained not by pursuit, but by steadfastness. What belongs to the believer remains secure when they refuse to let contradiction redefine their position. The seventh truth is that resistance is not the time to negotiate. It is the time to enforce what has already been finished. This principle is critical because many believers interpret opposition as a reason to reconsider their position, when in reality, opposition is often the clearest indicator that authority is being tested, not defeated. Resistance does not appear to negotiate terms. It appears to challenge recognition, and that challenge is where authority must become active. When pressure rises, the natural tendency is to slow down, reconsider, or try to find a compromise. But spiritual authority does not function on compromise because truth does not change based on resistance. What has already been established remains unchanged regardless of opposition. So the presence of resistance is not evidence that something is untrue. It is evidence that something is being contested. This is where the believer's response becomes decisive. Instead of entering into dialogue with pressure, they reinforce what has already been declared. They do not shift their language from confidence to uncertainty. They do not reduce their stance to accommodate contradiction. Instead, they treat resistance as a signal to stand firmer, speak clearer, and refuse agreement with anything that contradicts established truth. In this understanding, negotiation is actually a form of surrender because it assumes that the opposing force has equal authority. But authority does not negotiate with what it governs. It commands alignment with what is already established. So when symptoms, fear, or lack present themselves, the response is not discussion, but enforcement of truth already known. This also reframes spiritual endurance. Endurance is not passive waiting, it is active holding. It is the refusal to release position under pressure. The believer is not trying to create victory in the moment of resistance. They are standing in victory already secured and insisting that reality align with it. Therefore, resistance becomes a revealing point. It exposes whether authority is understood or still being developed. And for the believer who understands, resistance becomes an opportunity to demonstrate clarity, not confusion, and to enforce what has already been completed rather than debate what is already settled. The eighth truth is that understanding authority transforms prayer from desperation into domination in the spirit realm. This is not about attitude alone, but about a complete shift in awareness of position. When authority is not understood, prayer often becomes emotional pressure, full of pleading, repetition, and uncertainty. But when authority is understood, prayer becomes decisive communication from a positioned believer who knows they are operating under delegated jurisdiction. Desperation is rooted in the belief that something is missing or uncertain. It speaks from lack, and therefore it sounds like begging. But domination in the spiritual sense is not arrogance or self-confidence. It is alignment with a higher authority that has already spoken. The believer is not trying to create outcomes through emotion. They are enforcing outcomes through agreement with established truth. This is why understanding changes everything. The same person who once prayed with anxiety begins to pray with clarity and certainty. In this transformed state, prayer is no longer a struggle to reach heaven, but a release of heaven's order into earthly circumstances. The believer stops approaching situations as if they are powerless observers and begins addressing them as authorized representatives. Words become intentional, focused, and directed, not scattered with uncertainty. There is a sense of stability because authority does not fluctuate with feelings. This does not mean challenges disappear immediately in experience, but it does mean the believer no longer responds to challenges from a place of inferiority. Instead, they remain anchored in what is already true, regardless of what is temporarily seen. That inner shift is what produces consistency in faith, even when external conditions resist change. Ultimately, this truth reveals that transformation in prayer begins internally, not externally. The moment a believer understands who they are and what they carry, their entire approach changes. Prayer becomes less about trying to obtain victory and more about enforcing what victory has already secured. And in that place, desperation fades, and authority becomes the defining expression of their spiritual life. In conclusion, the authority of the believer is not a concept to admire, it is a position to live from. Everything shifts the moment a person stops seeing themselves as someone trying to get God to move and starts realizing they are called to enforce what has already been accomplished. Authority removes uncertainty from prayer, silence from faith, and hesitation from speech. It replaces begging with boldness and confusion with clarity. The believer was never designed to negotiate with circumstances, but to stand in a finished victory and declare alignment with it. When identity is understood, prayer stops sounding like desperation and starts functioning like direction. Words are no longer emotional expressions of hope, but confident releases of truth that govern situations instead of reacting to them. Every struggle in understanding authority comes down to one thing: whether a believer will accept their position or remain passive in it. But once that position is embraced, everything changes. Fear loses its voice, doubt loses its influence, and resistance loses its intimidation. Not because opposition disappears, but because authority is finally being exercised. This is the turning point, from asking to enforcing, from pleading to declaring, from waiting to standing, from negotiation to command. the believer begins to live with the awareness that they are not beneath circumstances but above them in authority, called to bring alignment rather than request permission. So the final call is simple. Stop negotiating with what you were authorized to govern. Stand firm in what has been given, speak with clarity rooted in truth, and live from the confidence of a position already secured. Because once authority is understood and exercised, life is no longer lived in uncertainty, but in the strength of a delegated kingdom expressed through a believer who knows exactly who they are and what they carry.